Aesop Rock is an incredible rapper and artist by any stretch of the imagination. Hugely underrated despite how consistently he's been putting out great album after album for over 20 years, and he's releasing another very soon. I'm very excited. It'll probably be out by the time this is released, but his music isn't everyone's tastes, and I understand that because it's incredibly verbose, lyrically very dense to the extent you really need to sit down and go through the lyrics line by line to figure out what he's even saying half the time. Normally that sort of confused heaviness in lyrics is the exact sort of thing I'd find painfully pretentious. I remember at the start of my literature degree we had to do some exercise responding to an argument by a guy called Will Self, who had written this article about why novels should deliberately use long and unknown words to boost people's vocabulary, and so for my degree I wrote this long article back basically suggesting he was an idiot, because I was like that when I was young, you know, contentious and arrogant. But as far as I see it, I do think the point is picking words to have the most emotional impact. No one cares about the wordiness itself. That'd be like praising a piano performance where they mashed every key as quickly as possible to show off how quickly they can move their fingers. As opposed to like Chopin's Fourth Prelude, a very straightforward piece of music that has a lot of emotional impact. So yeah, normally I'd hate overly wordy stuff to the point of confusion, but Aesop Rock is very much the exception to that rule because he doesn't feel pretentious at all to me. I think that's partly because of how weird it is. See, he crafts insanely intricate lines that kind of batter you over the head with bizarre abstract image after bizarre abstract image that somehow marry together beautifully evocative poetry alongside comical cartoon images and strange humour, which makes it all feel comically jarring. You know, as vivid and detailed as it is, he's not painting these grand, poetic, show-off kind of images, but something more cartoonish and oddly specific, and there's humour in that. It's like, you know, Wallace and Gromit, and how Wallace builds these ludicrously complex contraptions to actually do something very simple, like put jam on a piece of toast, and you're like, you could have taken a simpler route, Wallace. Aesop Rock's rap is like that. It's comical how complex a route he takes in pretty much every line of his lyrics. And I think that's half the point. He's half poking fun at himself for being so complex and elusive, and that mixed with his deliberately jarring cartoonish imagery that is also genuinely beautiful language, that makes for something both incredibly highbrow and incredibly down to earth at the same time. It's weird, but it works.
Opt out, sober on the eve, no sing sting. Locating aim, but a token propane tank, bang. All hot Chewy, no costume. Black hoodie, you can set your watch to. Tall drink, depths like an air raid. Radically detached with purveyors of the hairbrain. Show a new crop, how we used to moonwalk. Out of breath like a 7-day-old balloon dog. Flash that buttery gold, jittery zeitgeist, withered by the watering hole. Water patrol, water we the heart, how could be art buckery suddenly? Not enough young in his lung for the waterway.
You get the picture. It's comically baffling, and he regularly pokes fun at how cryptic he himself is, like in the song Shrunk, which details his experience of seeing a therapist, and it's just funny imagining that this therapist is asking questions about him that even just talking about his own feelings, he's expressing himself in the same weirdly cryptic and absurd manner to the point the therapist gets confused, and there's this exchange in the song.
She said, when you start getting all expressive and symbolic, it's impossible to actualize an honest diagnostic. I said, when you start getting all exact and algebraic, I'm reminded it's a racket, not a rehabilitation.
Anyway, the point of that long introduction is that I think he's fantastic. In equal parts, incredibly poetic and incredibly ridiculous. I've wanted several times to try and break down one of his songs here, but the problem is they're always so intricate. There's so many references to everything from high art to arcade games that you can kind of just get lost in this labyrinth of images to the extent the video would be too long-winded and confused. And I tried several times, but I kept giving up because it's always too all over the place. As such, I've picked a slightly more straightforward song, which is Cycles To Gehenna from the album Skelephon, which is also one of my favourite. This is my go-to drive the car around at night song. I'm not going to go through every line because we will get lost, and I think Rap Genius can do a better job of that anyway. We'll start with a quick summary of the premise though, for those of you who aren't familiar. It's a story about this bloke on a motorbike riding around a city at night at high speed, kind of to try and forget about the death of his friend. You know, he finds it therapeutic. Partly it's an act of travelling which makes it feel symbolically like you're leaving things behind, you know. That's part of why I think holidays feel so relaxing. We get the illusion of leaving ourselves behind for a week or two until we realise actually it's all still there with us. But it's that, and it's also just how fast he's driving, how in the moment that makes him. That focus takes his concentration off the death of his friend, and you get the line at the end of the first verse.
Here's how a great escape goes when you can't take your dead friend's names out your phone.
Which I think sums up the biker's emotional state right now. He's not ready to really say goodbye to his friend yet. He's still got his number saved, he's in the pits of grief, but that grief is very painful, and right now he just wants a moment of escape, of rest and peace and ease without it on his mind for once. But the clever thing about this song, images of death permeate through the description of everything. You know, just in the way the roads and other cars and everything is described, you see images of death, like even in this act to help him forget, even then, death is still showing up. His friend is still there fixed on his mind. He's trying to escape but he can't, so you get the biker himself described to us as
Anyone's pale horse painted gunmetal black face masking,
where a pale horse is a traditional image of death, and his headlights are described
blinker like a hallowed bonfire over Samhain.
Samhain being a Celtic festival to usher in the dark part of the year, and so has various links to death and departed spirits, or engines described as haunted mowers, and this Dartmoor bike that he's cobbled together from various different parts being described like attempting to poorly reanimate something that's dead. So whatever escape the biker is attempting is kind of failing. Death looms everywhere in this song, as it does throughout most of the album, titled Skeleton, meaning, you know, a marathon of skeleton things. It's sort of biographical in the sense Aesop Rock was mourning the death of his close friend and fellow rapper Camuteo, but for various reasons we'll see the biker in this song isn't Aesop Rock himself. Because the other thing I haven't mentioned about the biker is this wonderful unconscious behaviour in his action. Consciously, the biker is riding round high speed through a city to try and forget about the death of his friend. Unconsciously, however, he's flirting with his own death and the chance that he might crash into something. Maybe not necessarily death, maybe it's just flirting with self-harm, but that sort of thing can happen. It's obviously not the only reason people might drive recklessly, but in that person's mind it's fun, it's an act to make them feel alive again for a moment, yet at the same time there's an unconscious sort of idea of, well, I don't want to kill myself, but if there's another car coming, or if the turn's too tight to avoid the wall, then that's what will happen. Nature will have decided it for me. I'll just put myself in a precarious situation and see what happens. Deliberately putting yourself in nature's hands, I guess. And so actually the first verse of this song starts with the crash, this biker's death, before we then go back in time to basically describe him riding around the city beforehand. But let's get into it, you know. The first verse opening with the lines,
base heads locally approach all spark plugs, total disregard for a dying man shark jump,
which is a wonderfully disturbed image of this biker having just crashed and died, but then all these drug addicts just coming out like rats or vultures to scavenge spark plugs from his bike, because as far as I understand, spark plugs are good for helping you break into cars. But all with total disregard for a dying man's shark jump. A shark jump being a phrase for like that one last attempt, this last ditch roll of the dice to try and regain relevance or fame or whatever it is, but it going wrong and things only getting worse after the shark jump. And there is something kind of suicidal or flirting with death about that, this last ditch attempt to put the death of his friend behind him, or else as it transpires, to be consumed by death himself. As a side note as well, it's really interesting that Aesop Rock described the biker's crash helmet as a
pork-shelled ebony propeller hat,
which I think sums up the way he does mash a cartoonish feel into his imagery a lot of the time, because propeller hats are those cartoon stereotypical hats worn by innocent kids for some reason. I don't know why that's a thing in cartoons, but it's an interesting description. This supposedly hard-looking, black painted pale horse of a biker, yet this childish propeller hat. Which I think points to the sad truth that whatever the facade this character wants to create of himself as grisly and hard-edged a biker, he is still a child underneath. He's someone young and helpless. Somebody's son, you know? Anyway, the song then goes back in time before the crash now with the lines,
tuck got a steel toe, metal gate spreading for the dead alive that ran in parking space 37.
I think describing him as dead alive again sums up his emotional state, but this is a description of the garage door opening, this metal gate while he sat ready on his bike to drive out there into the rest of the song. And there's an allusion being made to him being a daredevil and the mention of the song's title, Cycles To Gehenna, which here sounds like the name for the Daredevil show, but yeah, it's a song title to perfectly summarise all of this. Gehenna, correct me if I'm wrong, being a valley outside of Jerusalem associated with the afterlife, a place where they throw away the waste and sewage of Jerusalem. Either way, this idea of cycling to Gehenna is an image of riding your bike off to the afterlife, and the first verse ends,
No zen in the art of maintenance, only as the orchestrated patron saint of changing lanes, baby. Here's how a great escape goes when you can't take your dead friends' names out your phone.
Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance is a famous kind of Zen explained simply sort of book, but it's a clever sort of wordplay here, because Aesop Rock is suggesting the biker finds no zen in maintaining his bike, only in this high-speed riding around the city to take his mind off things, like I mentioned earlier. That's the first verse anyway, and what we get is then a chorus which kind of visually describes the moment of death and the crash of the biker in an interesting way.
Eyes and teeth, new moon on a scale that defies belief. Outside what our fundamental sciences teach. Every other mighty lion asleep. Gangway, mind, eyes, mind, teeth.
We've got the eyes and teeth of this oncoming vehicle, the headlights and the grille. So close now that they look massive, described like a new moon that's so huge it defies belief, which is an interesting comparison because seeing a giant moon in the sky puts you in awe and makes you recognise just how small and insignificant and mortal a human being you really are in the grand scheme of nature. Obviously it looks so huge to the biker because it's right in front of him. It gets so close it crashes into him. So gangway, mind the eyes and the teeth of this oncoming vehicle, except the biker can't avoid it. As is described at the very end of the final verse, the biker is riding through a narrow tunnel at this moment.
Bright light tunnel, kings tucking the devil. P.S. I wrote this on a self-destructing memo.
Which is a clever image because in a literal sense he's riding through a tunnel that's lit up with the bright light of this oncoming vehicle, and the tunnel is too narrow for him to escape, to swerve out of the way, but also this is obviously the light at the end of the tunnel sort of image of travelling to the afterlife. Anyway, I kind of think I did just summarise and explain all of the song already, and this could seem a fitting place to end a video, but there's just so many nice images to this song that I want to pick out.
Man ape translates glam through the visor, goes in water lilies, amps, grace, Geiger, and Man Ray, crammed in a one-player campaign, blinker like a hallowed bonfire over Sam Hain.
Describing the biker as a man ape, I think, emphasises the primal feel of this ride of death, but to him, the visor of his helmet translates the surroundings he sees and makes them much more artistic from the seat of his bike. Suddenly, the surroundings look like the famous Monet Water Lilies painting, and then when he's travelling at high speed, that image gets stretched and blurred until it looks like art made by Geiger or Man Ray, which are two artists you think would better reflect the biker's feelings than Monet would. And also crammed in a one-player campaign, I think conveys the video game fun feel of this ride around the city, where he's not quite taking it seriously, the fact that he could literally die if he crashes. It's just like a game to him on a conscious level.
The 30-odd-year-old gear stank Charlie, scarf dank mom's new hobby, copy.
The fact this bike is so old and so Frankensteined in its build, I think tells us the bike isn't too concerned with making sure he stays safe and alive. I mean, if he was smart, he would have taken pains to make sure the bike is properly maintained and that nothing will go wrong while he's riding it, but again, it's this unconscious feeling of, well, I'm not going to carefully maintain the safety of the bike, I'll just let it get a bit worn down, and if that happens to lead to it breaking and causing my death, then so be it, it's out of my hands. But just to mention of the fact this biker is wearing a scarf knitted by his mum, who's recently taking up a hobby in knitting, you know, just to remind us again, this is someone's son, this is someone with a family who are going to mourn his death. It just reminds us how tragic what this guy is doing really is. And the song draws back for the final verse. The beat dies away and we get this quieter string sounding repeat or whatever it is. I think this kind of signals the afterlife now, and the final verse then opens with the lines,
"It was less of an act of hubris, more a Lonely Hearts Club at the helm of a magic bullet."
which confirms for us he didn't crash and die because of an arrogant assumption that he could ride around as fast as he likes and not get hurt. It wasn't hubris. It was something half suicidal, a lonely heart missing his friend, placed at the helm of a magic bullet, which visually a magic bullet could kind of suggest the bike itself, or visually could suggest kind of metaphorically putting a gun to his head, but the wishful hope of what a magic bullet is, I think, kind of brings us back to the idea of jumping the shark and this wishful last-ditch attempt. Either I put it all behind me on this journey, or I die. Either I escape my feelings, or I escape life.
Away on a relentless bid for rarefied inertia, rattle trap books married to the patchy terra firma.
He is relentless in his pursuit of Gehenna, whether he realises it or not. I think that's what's so tragic about this, how relentless he is. And inertia means a state of stillness, something unchanged, which I think is why we can take this rare inertia he's chasing after to mean death itself, and that kind of stillness, that total escape from feeling. Because I think that's kind of what it's about. It's not he wants to die, it's he wants to escape his feelings, rather than trying to come to terms and process them. Deciding they're too unbearable to possibly process and have to be escaped. That's the tragedy, I think. And again, Rattletrap Forks points to this bike being poorly maintained and that they're now married to the patchy, bumpy, uneven grounds below. The bike has crashed and become merged with the earth.
Traffic amassed against insufferable odds, fashioning gallows out of plastic and bone.
He can see ahead of him the traffic is too heavy to possibly avoid crashing into. The odds are too great to possibly beat, but he drives in anyway. He's now fashioning himself a gallows out of the plastic and bone of the vehicles colliding with his body. And then, as I said earlier, the song ends with the lines,
"Bright light tunnel, kings tuck and the devil. P.S. I wrote this on a self-destructing memo."
Self-destructing memo, I think, tells us his story is going to go unheard, hence a load of drug addicts climbing over with total disregard for him. His final words, the explanations he might give for his death, will go unknown. We know he's sad at the death of his friend, but that's kind of all we know about his situation. We've not been given the chance to learn anything more, which is terribly tragic, and the song now just goes dead, like a self-destructing message, or like a flat line. It's a brilliantly sad song with wonderfully vivid description about grief and death, and this idea that the death of the biker's friend could lead him to destroying his own life too, rather than coming to terms with it or cherishing and making the most of it. This is the third song on the album, a whole album to do with death, so it does offer us little conclusion really. I think we have to go further into the album to get much resolution, if any, to death and grief, but that's as far as this video goes. The song details a man's desire to escape a reality that can be difficult to face up to. It's a great song. Everything Aesop Rock does is incredible. One of the most lyrical songwriters out there, not even just rappers. He's fantastic. I cannot wait for his new album. But yeah, if you have any thoughts, comment them below. Let me know if you'd like more analysis of Aesop Rock. I think I'd pick a cheerier song next time. I think I've seemed to have done quite a few videos recently to do with death, so I'm going to lay off that for a while, I think. Otherwise it's going to start looking like I've got a morbid obsession. Like the video if you liked it. Subscribe if you want more. Support me on Patreon if you want even more, but otherwise, hopefully see you next time. And a special thank you goes to Brian Newbert, Devin, David Kling, Darren Burdock-Latter, Kestrel, Gay Hitler, Samara Salsi and Sharakov2814. Thank you.